We're about to begin turn 7 of this playthrough of Red Typhoon. We've seen that the Soviets are behind schedule. They made some very powerful attacks last turn in the sectors of the Kalinin and WR fronts. The Germans fell back to still hold something of a line, and we've seen partisans popping up behind German lines, and this may be a turn where we can see some concerted action by the partisans and aggressive moves towards victory point cities. So, let's start with turn 7. We begin with the Soviet activation phase. The Soviets receive 6 activation points. They had none left from the last turn, so they'll have to do everything this turn with 6. On to the Soviet movement phase. And we see that where the Soviets are strongest is in the sector of the WR front and the Kalinin front. They have a very strong concentration of forces there. So that means that activation points must be allocated to those two formations for movement and combat. So that means that there go 4 activation points. So that leaves 1 more. And as we stated at the beginning of this video, partisans are close to victory point cities, which is causing disruption in the German side, having to allocate forces to make sure the partisans do not cause much damage. So we may see now partisans moving, and that will be the first activation point. So the Soviets spend their first activation point to activate the AP front for movement. AP means airborne and partisan. The partisan unit in partisan sector 6 moves to the outskirts of Roslav. Similarly, the partisan unit in partisan sector 1 approaches Velis. And the last partisan unit, the one in sector 4, is about to be enveloped by 2 German units, so it moves in the direction of Spasdemensk. And last but not least, the airborne unit moves into Sychevka, taking control of that German victory point city, and marches further south to come in contact with 2 German units. Sychevka is now under Soviet control. Now it's the turn of the WR front for movement. So we spend the second Soviet activation point to activate that formation for movement. There's an interesting situation here that may develop for the Soviets if they force these 2 German units to retreat more than 1 hex. Note that this hex is not in the zone of control of other German units. So if the Soviets bring breakthrough units like this misprinted cavalry unit to attack in conjunction with other Soviet units, that cavalry unit could break out and move 1 additional hex, and that could cause a serious gap to develop here. So let's see how the Soviets approach this situation. They have another breakthrough unit, an armored unit in the proximity also of the area. So these are the positions of the WR front before movement, and these are the positions after movement. What we see here are very aggressive attacks, even though they're not going to be high odds. With the help of another unit of the Kalinin front, the Soviets could probably achieve here a 3-to-1 attack. The most they can achieve here are 2-to-1 attacks, except here that it most probably will be a 3-to-1, and here another 2-to-1 attack. The other Soviet formation that must move and attack is the Kalinin front. So we spend our third activation point to activate the Kalinin front for movement. Here are the positions of the Kalinin front units before movement. And here are the positions after movement. We will see strong attacks here against this sole German infantry division in the hopes of advancing and breaking the line here. And perhaps the Soviets will get lucky and push these two Germans' division back, and they're supporting the WR front in their attack also. Soviets have 3 action points left, and they can either move the units of the WL front, the Bryansk front, or the units in the Northwest front. Soviets spend their 4th activation point to activate the Northwest front for movement. So these are the positions before movement, and this is after movement, and we won't be seeing any attacks by the Northwest front. There's only 2 activation points left. So that's the end of the Soviet movement phase, 2 activation points left, and we will see attacks only by the WR and Kalinin fronts. So the Soviets spend their last 2 activation points to activate those 2 fronts for attack. And we start with the Soviet attack against the 2 German infantry divisions defending Gzhatsk. 17 against 7. That is a 2-to-1 attack with a -1 because the defenders are in a city. We roll 1d6. A 5 modified to a 4. Defender retreats 1 hex, and the Soviet attacks are off to a good start. The Germans retreat and are disrupted. The Soviets advance and take that victory point city. Next attack is a little to the south. We see 3 Soviet units attacking 2 panzer divisions. This is 13-6. Another 2-to-1 attack with no modification. We roll 1d6, but the roll is a 1. Attacker retreats. So all 3 attacking units retreat 1 hex and are now disrupted. Now we move on to the critical attack against the 2 German units to the northwest of Gzhatsk. 14 against 7. Another 2-to-1 attack with no modification. We roll 1d6, and the result is a 3 contact, and all units stay in their positions. So far, the Soviet attacks have failed to reach their objectives, pushing back a majority of the German units. So we move our attention now to the Soviet attacks by both fronts near Sychevka. So we have 3 hexes of Soviet units attacking 2 German infantry divisions. A 3-to-1 attack with no modification. Another 1 and another contact result. And the Germans are holding their ground. The attack here would be 1-to-1 with a -1 because of the wood, so the Russians won't even try it. We move further to the north. And here we have 3 stacks of Soviet units attacking the 253rd Infantry Division in Woods. A 3-to-1 attack with a -1 die roll modifier. A 4 modified to a 3, and the defenders have to retreat 1 hex. So the sole infantry division that was defending is retreated 1 hex and disrupted. And the Soviets occupy the vacated hex. And that is the end of the combat phase. So we see that the attacks during this combat phase were mostly failures. No holes were created in the Soviet lines. And the Germans have an equal number of activation points this turn as the Soviets. They have 6, so we may see some counterattacking coming up. We just finished the Soviet combat phase. We skip the next 3 phases and go now to the Soviet recovery phase. The Soviet units that attacked during this combat phase and had to retreat are now flipped to their front sides. And that's the end of the Soviet turn. Now we proceed to the German activation point phase. Germans received the most activation points so far in a turn, 6. And that's what they will have for this turn. With the failure of the Soviet attacks, the most imminent threats are actually those by partisan units operating behind enemy lines, so the Germans will definitely need to activate the reserve units in order to check these concerted partisan actions. So the Germans spend their first activation point to activate the reserve formation for movement. The majority of the reserve formation units are facing the northwest front. So here are their positions before movement and after movement. They've placed one division here in the back as a reserve, and they've sent the 12th Infantry Division to help out the battered 9th Army in the vicinity of Nelidovo. Meanwhile, the 2 German divisions that are chasing the partisans heading for Velish move now, and they surround the partisans. Meanwhile, in the south, near Roslav, the German 208th Division moves and enters the Victory Point city to halt the advance by the partisans. Meanwhile, near Spas-Demensk, there are no units of the reserve formation, so those partisans for now are unchecked. Moving our attention to the south of Spas-Demensk, we see that the units of the Soviet WL front have overextended themselves, so it's time for the 2nd Panzer Army to move. The Germans spend their second activation point to activate the 2nd Panzer Army for movement. Here we see the positions of the 2nd Panzer Army units before movement and after movement. They are outstretching themselves in order to allow for 2 attacks that may eliminate or at least surround some Soviet units. The units of the 4th Army are fairly strong and have held the line in the last turns. They're still holding the Victory Point city of Yuknov, and the partisans are threatening Spas-Demensk, so it's time for them to move. The Germans spend their 3rd activation point to activate the 4th Army for movement. So these are the positions of the units of the 4th Army. They have to take care of the partisan unit approaching Spas-Demensk, and also there's an opportunity to push back some Soviet units and probably create a very nasty situation behind their lines. And these are the positions after movement. We will probably see some attacks in this area, maybe against this infantry division, perhaps this infantry unit. Time to take our attention further north in the sector of the 4th Panzer Army. They have been taking the brunt of the latest Soviet attacks. Many of their units are already adjacent to Soviet units. They've lost the city of Gazhatsk, and the Soviets' next target is Vyazma. So we will see now the 4th Panzer Army probably falling back 1 hex to force the Soviets to spend an activation point to move those units. So the Germans spend their 4th activation point to move the units of the 4th Panzer Army. Note that the only German units of this formation that cannot move are the disrupted units to the southwest of Gazhatsk. That's the movement of the 4th Panzer Army. Now we unveiled one unit of the reserve formation that had not moved, the 246th Infantry Division, and it will move right now. And it moves towards the rear to act as a reserve. And that's the end of the movement of the 4th Panzer Army. The Germans still have 2 more activation points. See that the German situation here in the sector of the 9th Army is critical. Only 5 units, one of them disrupted. That means that unit can't move Olenino is not a victory point town. So the Germans spend their 5th activation point to activate the 9th Army for movement. And here are the positions before. Now after movement, the Germans sent 1 unit to Nelidovo, a victory point city, and this 251st Infantry Division as a reserve, falling back 1 hex the other units except the disrupted 253rd Infantry Division. That's the end of the German movement phase. They have 1 activation point left. So that means they can activate 1 formation for attack. Remember that panzer units can attack without any activation points. So do they activate the 4th Army units or the 2nd Panzer Army? And it seems that the 2nd Panzer Army has 2 units that are not panzer divisions, but would be needed, would be critical in order to execute attacks against these 2 Soviet units. Therefore, we proceed to the German combat phase. The Germans spend their last activation point to activate the 2nd Panzer Army for attack. So let's take a close look at the situation. The Germans can attack with these 2 units. It would be a 2-to-1 with no modification. And they would still have enough strength for a 4-to-1 attack against the weak 2-6 unit. And if they sequence that attack first and occupy this hex, this attack would be against an isolated unit, which would give them a +1 die roll modifier. But the Germans may get even more greedy. If they attack this unit with this Panzer Grenadier unit and one of these panzer divisions, that frees up the panzer division in the bottom to attack also in conjunction with these 2 panzer units, the Soviet armored unit in Kirov, 9-4. That will be a 2-to-1 attack, but with a -1 die roll modifier because the defenders are in a city. That means that the Germans would forcibly need a 6 or a 5 to cause a retreat. But if they do, and this hex is under German control, that Soviet unit would be eliminated. So do the Germans go for that ambitious but weak 2-to-1 attack? No. First we'll start with this attack here, and it will be these 3 units 4-to-1 against the weak Soviet unit. 4-to-1 attack, no modification, we roll 1d6. The result is a 5. Defender retreats 3 hexes. Remember that the defender is retreated always by the attacker. And now the unit is disrupted. The Germans occupy the vacated hex. Now, these 2 units of the 2nd Panzer Army attack the 4-5 unit. This is a 2-to-1 attack, and that unit is isolated. There's a +1 die roll modifier. So it's 2-to-1, we roll 1d6, and the result is a 2 modified to a 3 contact. So the Russian unit, which is surrounded, survives, and all units remain in place. That's the end of the German combat phase. No other panzer formations that can attack without activation points are in any real position of conducting a feasible attack. So we move on to the German recovery phase. And the 2 German infantry divisions to the southwest of Gazhatsk are flipped to their front sides, as well as the 253rd Infantry Division of the 9th Army. And that's the end of the German recovery phase and the end of turn 7. So, turn 7 has ended. The Soviets have failed to break through the lines, and the Germans have consolidated their positions. The partisans seem to be no longer a threat. So, the situation is turning even more desperate for the Soviets, who must score more victory points, and they only have 2 more turns to do so. So, stick around for turn 8, coming up next in this playthrough of Red Typhoon. This is Stuka Joe signing off for now. Thanks for watching.